Okay, gang, this is Q&A, so the floor is open, yeah.
I'd like to understand how we define the leap years. I have a reference that is related with a 19-year cycle. I'd like to know how we...
Okay, I can't tell you in detail because I've not studied the astronomy carefully. It's a 17-year cycle, and the only thing I can tell you is that it is extraordinarily accurate. Over 2,000 years, I think the drift has been about a day and a half, and the day and a half is in favor of our placement of the holidays, as against the Roman calendar, which in the 1700s was like 12 days out, and they took 12 days out of the calendar to readjust it, and they put in an extra quarter day because it was not calculated well, and but I don't know in detail how it's constructed. I just don't know. Yeah.
I always thought this one was a bit obvious, but I was speaking to a rabbi, and he said that even if someone were theoretically to show him that there was reason not to believe in God, then there was a logical, sound reason that it seemed implausible there's a God or something like that, then he would still continue believing. I'm
lost. Try it again. A person would choose not to believe in God. What?
The question was, if someone theoretically would show you how belief in God was not rational,
yes,
would you continue believing?
Yes. Oh, I see. Well, if someone was to show you that belief in God was not rational, well, I think that would be quite difficult. You know, it's sort of like if someone would convince you that 2 + 2 is 5. What would you do? I think I'd just be confused, actually. You could take a particular reason for believing in God, and you could show that there was a difficulty with that reason. That might happen. But a belief in God is not the sort of thing that can be conclusively refuted, because the qualities that God has are not open, all of them, to individual investigation. So it would be, I think, very difficult to... Let's try to be a little careful here. There's a difference between positively showing that the belief in God is irrational versus showing that reason doesn't require a belief in God. Those are two different projects. Positively show that belief in God is irrational, I think would be very, very difficult.
But if someone were, would you...
Yeah, but now I don't know what to do with if someone were, where the thing you're talking about is something that I can't imagine happening. How can I plot the consequences of something which I can't understand? What would happen if someone showed that 2 + 2 is 5? What would you do? How would you respond? How would society respond? I mean, the clue, because I can't imagine doing that. I can't imagine what it would mean. So the hypothetical of what would you do when the thing you're talking about is something that doesn't fit into your framework at all is very difficult to deal with in a reasonable way. You know, what would happen if it was proven to you that you're not human? What would you do? You would know where to start, right? You would know, and if that was proven to you, then you'd say, well, then I don't know that the earth is round. I don't know that I'm breathing. I don't know that the time goes forward, because if that could be wrong about that, it could be wrong about everything. And if it would be wrong about everything, then everything would go out the window, and I wouldn't have anything left. So I can't deal with that. I mean, the hypothetical is so far from our experience to ask what would happen if X, when X is too far from your experience or your imagination, is an idle question. I don't know what would happen. Yeah.
Do you think is there any benefit in reading certain philosophers like Levinas or Hilary Putnam later in his life, where you start in their writings more in Judaism?
Well, yeah, but secular philosophers who wrote things about Judaism. I did read some Levinas. He has a book, I think it's called 9 Talmudic Readings, which someone asked me to read, and it's quite clear there that his reading of Jewish sources is this: he's a committed socialist. He's looking for ammunition, and he can find any piece of Jewish literature which could be twisted, shredded, pounded into a socialist frame. He'd be happy to use it. But it wasn't a scintilla, not a hint of what can I learn from this literature that I don't already know? What should I change in my worldview because this literature says so? What kind of new thinking and thinking that will cause me to revamp my old views will be provoked by this, that openness wasn't there at all. So I thought to myself, what am I going to learn from this guy? He has his preconceived ideas. He's using this as a means to promote his ideas. I'm not going to learn anything from him. Hilary Putnam was one of the 20th century's most outstanding philosophers. And by the way, he founded and destroyed whole schools of thought, one of his own. So he is very open. And I have profound respect for him. But he had absolutely no training in Jewish sources whatsoever. Gave his dog a Jewish name. So I have great respect for him as a philosopher. He worked in my field, among the other fields that he worked in, philosophy of mathematics. He wrote a famous paper, I think it was 1991, which is entitled Philosophy of Mathematics, Why Nothing Works, where he simply summed up all of the 20th century efforts at solving the main problems of philosophy of math, and they don't work. He was 100% correct. So I have great respect for him, but if he's going to write about a subject that he's never studied, certainly not extensively, and certainly not in the original, I'm not likely to learn much from it.
There's a story in Ruach about doing renovations in Beis Hamikdash, and then they found the Torah and the Kohen Gadol.
Yeah.
What exactly did they find?
So it's an interesting thing. I wrote a piece on this, which is available. It's not clear. It says Sefer. If I remember correctly, it's Sefer HaTorah, which means the Torah scroll. The Torah scroll would mean one that was known. It had an identity beforehand. It's not a Torah scroll. It's the Torah scroll. I think the Malbim points that out. Now, there was one that went all the way back to Moses that they kept in the temple, and that's one candidate for what they found. By the way, the temple at that time was called the House of God, Yud Kei Vav Kei, the Hebrew name of God. Even though the king was an idol worshiper, people make a mistake. They project our exclusiveness in belief on the ancient times, which is a total mistake. For us, you're either a believer or you're not. And either you're a Christian or you're a Muslim or you're a Jew, and the one gives you an identity. And those days, it wasn't like that at all. It was something called syncretism, where you took a little of this and a little of that. You could believe in the God who took us out of Egypt, but you believe in the local Baal for your garden, and you worship both of them, and you offer sacrifices to both of them. It was that kind of circumstance. And then, of course, he goes into shock. When the king sees it, he goes into shock. And by the way, when the priest comes, having done the work on the temple, he tells them about the work and the money. And oh, by the way, he also found this book. And it was, the Kar commentator said it was open to the passage which describes the king and his responsibilities and what will happen if he doesn't follow the Torah. And that was a shock. One thing's for sure, it provoked an entire revolution, cultural revolution, where the king went back to the ways of his grandfather as opposed to his father.
He didn't know what's going to happen if he doesn't keep the Torah. I mean, he didn't have the Torah. The other.
He was a child, and he took over. His father was a famous exponent of idol worship, and the idea of having the book and reading the book, the whole capital was filled with idol worship. So there were traditions and ideas and stories and so forth and so on, but having an actual physical Sefer Torah, he certainly didn't have. Though he knew there was such a thing, but his world was filled with lots of things, I ask you, the average, let's say, conservative Jew, would he have a copy of the 1,000 pages of the Tanakh in Hebrew in his house? I doubt it. I doubt it very much. He's a Jew, but he's also working on Wall Street, and he's also a Democrat, probably. Unfortunately, I didn't say that. And and he has he's probably involved in Greenpeace, and he's got lots of things to do. And Judaism is one of them, but it's only one of them. Not so central to his life. I don't think this is surprising at all. You can look it up. I wrote a piece on that.
When the Jewish nation received the Torah and signed, what did they receive? Because in the Torah it says stories that say Chet and Rashi.
They didn't receive the Torah at Sinai. No one says that. No one believes that. It's not written or hinted at anywhere. They heard God speak and say the ten pronouncements at Sinai. That's what they got. The book, it says in Parashat Vayelech, which we read last week, that Moses wrote it at the end of his life. The book came into existence at the end of Moses' life, and he handed it out to the Kohanim. That's written in the Torah word for word. Where this idea came, the Torah came to Sinai, it's just, it's probably a Christian myth. And what they got after that was Moses taught them laws verbally, which he learned from God. But of course, the text describing later events was not available to them, just as it wasn't available to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob either.
So he wrote all the future texts, what's going to happen once they go into Israel, what's going to.
There were some predictions. Yes, God did reveal to him something. That's one of the things the prophet does. He tells you some of these will happen in the future. That's so surprising for us. Yeah.
I was wondering, in terms of Mazel, you still have a certain degree of faith, right? So, how do we understand?
Mazel means divine guidance, and some in the sources there's a distinction between what's called Mazel Elyon and Mazel Tachton, higher Mazel and lower Mazel. Techias talks about it, and Rabbi writes about it in detail. And the rough idea is this: there are certain things that are built into the world as the purpose of the world. There are other things that are built in as means by which we will achieve that purpose. The purpose is non-negotiable. The means can change. Indeed, there's a passage, I think it's chapter 40 in Isaiah, if I'm not mistaken, 40, 41, where he says that, that's about images. No, it's when Samuel was talking to Saul and criticizing for not wiping out Amalek, and he says, in one speech, he says, God has become disgusted with you, and nicham. Nicham means that he has changed his mind. It doesn't mean regret. That's a mistranslation. Rashi says so in Bereshis. He's changed his mind about that. And then he says that you have lost the kingship, and the kingship is going to go to David. And God is not like man. He doesn't change his mind. Lo yinachem. You just said he changed his mind. And now you say he doesn't change his mind. The answer is that Saul couldn't have been a permanent king. He didn't come from the house of Judah. He had to be a descendant of Judah. Judah was given the kingship when Jacob died. So you could at best be an interim. You could at best be an introduction. You couldn't set up a kingly line for the Jewish people. So as far as your role of being an interim or an introduction, that's a means by which the kingly line from Judah will be established. You can be traded off for somebody else, because it's only a means. But that the kingly line will come from Judah, and that is part of the goal, and therefore that can't be changed. That's what Yinachem means.
So I have a follow-up question now. So when God says he promises something, right, does that mean that our actions can change that?
Well, it says he promises something. That's rare, that God promises something. Sometimes statements are made about the future, but I think there's no, well, okay. The Rambam has a classification of prophecy, and he says, let's say God is speaking to Isaiah. Now, there are two cross-cutting distinctions, which means there are four possibilities. One question is what he tells Isaiah good or bad? And the other is it directed at Isaiah himself or at the people? Of the four possibilities, only one must happen. And that's where Isaiah is told something good that will happen to the people. That must happen. The other three don't have to happen. And this is pretty explicit. Jeremiah is arguing with false prophets of his time. Jeremiah is saying the Babylonians are going to destroy the temple, conquer the city and destroy the temple. And the false prophets, of whom there were many, were saying, no, God won't abandon his house, and won't abandon his city, and God is all powerful, and we're not in danger. So Jeremiah says to them, we're not equal, you and I. If what you say fails, then you're false prophets. Because you say that everything's going to be good. If what I say fails, I'm not a false prophet, because a prophecy of something evil is meant as a warning. not meant as a prediction. It's only a warning. And a warning can be retracted for many different reasons. The people might change and not deserve that kind of a punishment, or God may decide for whatever reason that the punishment should be delayed or carried out in another way. It's only a warning. Furthermore, if it's something good for the person himself, there he might have to earn it. That's why when God says to Jacob, you're going out and leaving the land of Israel, leaving your parents, you're going to go out and look for a wife, I'm going to protect you and watch you and guard you and give you everything that you need. And then 10 Psukim later, Jacob says, if you watch me, and if you protect me, and if you guard me, and if you give me everything that you need. And the commentators say, what do you mean if? He just told you he would. And the answer is, I told you I would, but I told it to you as an individual. That means you might have to earn it. And you might not earn it. And it's explicit later when he comes back and he's going to meet Esau. Esau's coming with a force of 400 men, where Jacob says, I'm afraid. He says, I've become small through all of the kindness that you have done for me. He became small. He lost weight, he shrunk. No, I had a certain amount of merit. You've already given me a lot. Maybe I've used it up, and therefore I don't deserve to receive all the other things that you told me that I would have. So the only one that is absolute is where the prophecy is something good for the people. And it's very important to know this, because one of the ways that you determine that someone's a prophet is he does something supernatural, and often the thing that he does is predict something for the future, and it has to be one of this category, because the other ones you can't test him. If it doesn't come true, it doesn't prove that he's not a true prophet. Anyway, that's roughly the ideas. Yeah.
So, what advice does the Rab have for feelings of loss, which means you feel there's something you've lost and there's no way to having it back, and it just feels kind of melancholic.
Feelings of
Loss.
Loss.
That you lost something that you
Oh.
can't.
Oh.
You just face this reality that is just comes upon you.
You know, in the Israeli army, when they take in a new soldier, very early on, in the first month, the first 2 months, there's a test that they have to pass. They are dropped into a completely wild place, I think with just a knife. And they have to survive for 5 days or something. They have to manage on their own. Now, imagine someone saying, but that's dumb. We have food. We have micro things that can keep you healthy. We have guns to shoot game with. Why would you only go with a knife? Because this is a test to see what you can do with just a knife. And use your intelligence, use your imagination, use your creativity to make up for the fact that you don't have those other things. Or you have sailboat races, and somebody says, what are you wasting your time for? I have a motorboat here. I'll get there first. Get a motorboat. Why working with sails? Because the skill is to be able to use sails to do it. There are certain things in life where the accomplishment is an accomplishment because of the limited circumstances under which you do it. Right? Flag football is now becoming a very impressive sport. They're talking about making it the Olympics. You don't tackle anybody; just pull a flag off his waist. Right? It's a different sport with a different. So now, if the person has something and he's lost it, if he understands divine providence, what he says is, the next challenge that I have to face is living without this. That's the challenge that's in front of me. Just like the soldier says, the challenge is to survive with just a knife. When I get out there in the field, I'm not going with just a knife. I'm going with the most advanced rifle and night goggles and heat-seeking goggles, aspect of the whole thing, right? But now the test is to develop this particular skill. Because Baruch was putting me through a path of development, and for my spiritual development, this is the thing that is necessary for me to be able to operate under. In a certain way, this happens to everyone, because the leaders who inspire you, the leaders whom you grow close to, who teach you and who guide you, die. And when they die, you have to live without them. And that's built into the way the world works. So obviously, loss is part of life. It's an inescapable part of life. You know, there's a verse that says, don't cast us off at the time of age, as our powers diminish or gradually disappear. Don't abandon us. So, for many years, when I was much younger, I had a completely wrong understanding of the verse. I thought I was asking that when I get old, my powers shouldn't diminish. No, that's not what it says. They will diminish. No question about that. The question is, will you still be connected enough? Will God be wanting to invest in you enough so that you still have something that's of importance to do? You know, Gottleib Steinman, the great people of the 20th and 21st century. I guess he died about 10 years ago. When he lived to 90-something. The last 10 years of his life, he took to traveling the world. And he explained to people, I can't learn the way I used to learn. I can't concentrate, I can't focus, I can't get to the depths of things, but I could inspire other people. So that's what I'm doing. In other words, what have I got left, and what can I do with it? This is the old parable about the glass that some say is half full and some say is half empty. So tell me, what's the truth? Who's right? They're both right. It's both half full and half full empty. Each one applies the other. So the question, as any cognitive psychologist will tell you, is how you frame it. Do you frame it as half full or frame it as half empty? Now, you can read in ancient history books about postcards. There were such things once upon a time, and they had pictures on them. And some of them were painted by paraplegics for the person who lost the use of his arms and legs, but his toes he had. And he learned to paint with his toes. And you see these pictures, and that's so. Some people who become paraplegics die of despair. I can't run, I can't jump, I can't ski, I can't dance. My life is over. The others say, well, what have I got left? And what can I do with what I have left? One guy became a weather forecaster. He learned how to use a computer with his toes. He looked at satellite pictures, and he learned how to predict the weather. So that's the spirit of that verse. Loss is part of life. And since it is part of life, it's meant to be. It's meant to be an element in the kind of spiritual creativity that you're put here to do. You know, I just want to add one more thing. I was asked once to speak about adolescence, and it occurred to me, many parents, I'm sure you can't imagine this, but someday you'll experience it, asking, why is that? You know, why can't he go from 9 to 23? Well, what's all this stuff in between? Suffering and torture and disaster and and confusion and destruction and. So, the point that I made in this lecture was that's a totally wrong perspective. God made us this way, so He wants us to be this way. There's got to be something to do there that's important. Now, what we call adolescence was invented about 200 years ago. For that, it wasn't that way. A fellow at NYU who wrote up the history of this. But it's part of our culture. It's part of our reality of development. So to turn your back on it is the wrong attitude. The idea is it's part of the course of development that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was putting you through so as to maximize the spirituality that you can attain. So you can look at it positively. You can look at loss positively. I'll give you one more bitter example. I mean, I did some sports. It wasn't very good, but it was good for me. And we had a coach who was anti-Semitic. So when everybody else did 50 push-ups, to the Jewish boys, he said, you guys do 70. Don't move till you do the 70. I got you. You're going to do 70. Dope! We became much better athletes that way. He thought he was getting us, cursing us and making us suffer. But a person says, this was designed. These things don't happen by accident. Nothing happens by accident. Yeah.
So if you were to make like a Venn diagram comparing and contrasting how you approach issues like halacha versus how you would approach like philosophy of math, logic, or philosophy of language, what would that kind of look like?
I don't think the Venn diagram would be the right thing here. I mean, I don't think it's relevant to this issue. But Aristotle pointed out 2,300 years ago that different disciplines have different methodologies. And there's no one size fits all in terms of the methods of analysis. And if somebody has the illusion, which probably is associated with about a dozen other illusions, that the scientific method is the way to investigate all of reality. Everything else is just imagination and bunk. And the scientific method is something like, you make an observation, then you think of a theory to explain it, and then you predict something on the basis of the theory, and then you test to see whether it's true or not, which is, that's not even a 4-year-old's description of science. But okay, that's what he thinks. I would ask him, is that how math is done? Do you make observations? Gee, 2 plus 7 is 9. Wonder why that is. Maybe it's because of, the orbit of the moon. That's why 2 plus 7 is 9. I could predict what it'll be with the number 66, and we'll see whether that's really true. And that's not the way math works. Math works with proofs, axioms, and proofs. It doesn't work with observation, theory, deduction, and confirmation at all. So there's no such thing as the method of investigating things. Different things have different investigation. There's what's called experimental science versus historical science. Some things in science are things about which you can do tests with experiments, and you can repeat them and you can gather the results, or maybe you need statistics. Other things you can't experiment with at all, like the Big Bang, or like evolution, which is a theory about how things develop, but you can't reproduce it in the wild or in the lab. So that being the case, they all have different methodologies. So there's no royal road to, and then to say, this will be done this way, this will be done this way. But I will tell you one thing. I was trained in philosophy of mathematics, so which means mathematics and the philosophical significance of mathematics. And in mathematics, you start with a small, hopefully, list of primitive propositions, which are axioms, which are supposed to be so obviously true that they can't be seriously questioned, and with a small vocabulary of ideas that are very simple, clear, and not controversial. Every other piece of vocabulary you use is defined in terms of the primitive vocabulary, and every proposition that you assert is demonstrated as following from the axioms that you started with. That's the way mathematics is organized. I was here listening to a shiur by a professor of mathematics at Harvard, Shlomo Sternberg, who was at that time the youngest full professor David ever had. He was a very religious Jew, and he was teaching the Dorim, and he starts talking about Isa Chefsa and Isa Gavra, which means a prohibition that attaches to a person or prohibition that attaches to a thing. And I said to him, how do you define those terms? And he said, we don't, and just kept going. And I thought, what? You don't? But how do you know what you're talking about? And the answer is, you don't. In any serious investigation, you don't know what you're talking about. You're trying to discover what you're talking about. Definitions come at the end of the road, not at the beginning of the road. The great achievements of science are to define mass, to define energy, to define momentum, to define conservation. These things come at the end of the scientific journey, not at the beginning. You gather information and you try to understand and you make hypotheses and you look for themes and you try to take the simplest concepts. And so it's an entirely different methodology. It took me years to adjust to the fact that Talmudic study is much more like theoretical empirical science than it is like math. For me, it was a struggle because I was trained to think in a certain way.
Do your thought process is very different when you do something like math than it is with like halacha or Talmudic study?
Well, philosophy of math, yes, because you're starting with a mathematical system. The mathematical system is defined in terms of its elements, and nothing gets in that isn't defined in terms of that. Like for example, in Chesed Zabatim, you have 30 daf, no psukim, just cases, case analysis. And you ask yourself, well, what do the basic terms mean? And every page it changes because you have new cases. And you got to apply those terms to this case. Well, so if you have to apply this case and that case, so then that definition won't fit both cases. So now I have to change the definition. You're changing your definitions all the time. That's part of the investigation. You don't start with that. You hope to end with that. The Achronim do this all the time. And Rishonim do it also by implication. So
it's logic, though, right?
Well, now the word logic becomes
Right.
And I think logic is much broader than other people think. I think intuition is part of logic also. So I think that just using logic is not going to...
Would it be closer to ethics then, or something like that?
What?
Like halacha or Gemara or something like that?
No.
With the idea
No,
of
it's much closer to empirical, to theoretical empirical science. because you have certain verses that are part of the data. You have certain laws that are part of the data. And your job is to understand those things. So you have given inputs, and then you have to create a system, first of all, where they relate to one another in some intelligible way, and then to find the principles behind it. It's much more like empirical science. Yeah.
How could you relate the good prophet, bad prophet that we just went over? Like how the person that predicts something bad can't be proven as a false prophet, but the person that predicts something good can be proven as a false prophet. Someone today who's using something mathematically, like a system such as Gematria, to quote-unquote predict basic everyday events, say like a hurricane, or the weather, or a sporting event, or any of these other things.
Okay, so now, first of all, a person's a candidate for prophet status only if he claims prophet status. And claim prophet status means I had a direct experience of the Creator, and the Creator either caused me to have a vision, or caused me to hear words, or both, and I meant to communicate them to you. That's the person who's claiming public prophet status. By the way, a prophet doesn't have to talk to anybody, doesn't have to communicate to anybody. It's a question of his relationship with God, where he receives certain things from God. There's nothing in the definition of prophet, say most people, though there are those who disagree, but like the Rambam and the Ramchal and others, that that's a relationship with God, a kind of attachment to God. Sometimes God says to the prophet, go and tell other people. Well, now why should I listen to him? He says he's a prophet. So what? Maybe he's lying, or maybe he's misled, and doesn't. So he's got to do something that's he has to be learned and wise, and he has to be perform the commandments of the Torah, and he has to have good moral and spiritual character, and he has to do something that's supernatural. Now, one of the conditions is that when he does something that's supernatural, there be no mistakes at all. Zero. It's got to be a 100% score. 99.99 is not good enough. No mistakes at all. The Rambam writes, others write, that the people who study the stars and astrology and so forth and so on make predictions, and some of them come true, but also some of them come false. And that's enough to disqualify them from our point of view. Now, you're talking about something else entirely. A person is using a certain method, like the numerical values of letters and words and sentences, or other word combinations, letter combinations, to make predictions. We have absolutely no reason whatsoever to trust that sort of thing. And here it would be like any other investigation. Try him out and see what he does. If he gets it right 80% of the time, I say that's a pretty good score. Take him seriously. Not that he's speaking for God, but just somehow he's getting them right. And if he predicts the stock market, pay attention. So he gets things like that right 80% of the time. If he got it right 100% of the time over an extended period in detail, then I think it would attract everybody's attention. But because it would attract everybody's attention, that just proves it doesn't happen, because we'd all know about it, and it doesn't happen. So these things are, the person's not claiming prophecy, and these things are not certified to have this kind of effect. So then you treat them like anything else. There was something called, I think it was called guided communication for autistic kids, where you'd have a board with letters on it, and you either take the kid's finger or give him a pencil, and he would point the letters, and he would communicate complicated thoughts and so forth and so on. And they asked someone about whether this is genuine or not. This person happened to be a Hasidic Jew who had a doctorate in psychology. And he said, I am required to believe Torah's Moshe. The Torah that came to us from Moses and later generations, I'm required to believe that. This is not written in Torah's Moshe. So I'm not required to believe it. So test it and see if it works. If it works, doesn't work, it doesn't work. In the end, it didn't work. But I think that's the basic attitude that you have to have. If it's written in Torah's Moshe, then I'm required to believe it. If it's not, then you treat it like anything else, coming from any source, and test it and see whether it works or not. Yeah.
Are not the Nevi'im and Ksuvim as, I know they're not on par in level of prophecy as a Torah, but aren't they up there, we have to also believe?
Yes, we have to believe what's written in the prophets and in the writings. Now, there is some discussion about the status of the prophets. This is not something that I've researched greatly, but I have a strong impression. And one place to look for this is in the Malbim's introduction to the book of Jeremiah, where he quotes an Abarbanel. And Abarbanel says that the prophets chose their own words to express the information that God inspired in them. And he had two proofs of it. One proof was that the different prophets write in very different styles. I guess the assumption being that if God were communicating the words, it wouldn't vary from person to person. And second of all, he said the book of Jeremiah is full of grammatical mistakes in Hebrew, and God wouldn't make grammatical mistakes in Hebrew. Well, the Malbim is against this, fire and brimstone. First of all, he says, could you imagine someone like Jeremiah, who was a farmer, and when God would put into his mouth the words of Isaiah, which are high poetry. You can imagine Jeremiah speaking to the people, communicating the prophecy. He gets finished, somebody goes over and says, well, what did you mean? He said, I don't know what I meant. I don't know what it means altogether. I'm just saying words. That's not the way that God wants prophecy to be communicated. So he gave the prophecy to different people in the languages that they could understand and could identify with. It's one thing. And number two, he said, Jeremiah was a prophet for more than 30 years. If you tell me that he was a farmer and he grew up in rustic circumstances, as his Hebrew was fractured, but not that it didn't change for 30 years. He spoke with kings. He spent time in Jerusalem. His Hebrew should have improved. So obviously, that's not an argument that it's his own words. And the Malbim says that God dictated the words of the prophets, just as he dictated the words to Moses. Now, what Moses got, what his words communicate, is of a far superior nature than the other prophets. And all the prophets get their authority from Moses, so there's no contest. It's a no-brainer. But the question of the accuracy, and then in the writings, many will tell you that the words are the words of the author themselves. And that's written with Ruach HaKodesh, not with prophecy, and Ruach HaKodesh is a much lower level of divine inspiration. But still, it's written with divine inspiration, and the information that's communicated is something that God wants us to know. And I suppose people would hesitate to take a paper written by Albert Einstein and say, oh, but look at these mistakes, he just missed it. Probably not. No, probably not. Probably you're not going to discover a mistake. Maybe you made a mistake, but you're not going to discover it. You're not on his bar. Yeah, but that's Einstein. That's not Solomon. Who's Solomon? Some religious guy, from 3,000 years ago. So, excuse me, thank you. I would certainly put Solomon above Einstein without any question. So I think that from our point of view, we take that as definitely as normative, even if the words were chosen by a human being. They weren't chosen by just any human being. They were chosen by people who God made special, and the Jewish tradition over 3,800 years, of whom there may be 50 people who are great and famous and special in 3,800 years. That's a very small percentage of people. And if he's one of the 50, I think it's appropriate to take everything he says, and be required to accept it. Yeah.
So many people point to like something like Gematria to show divineness of the Torah. Do you find these examples on their own to be compelling evidence?
No, not at all. And in fact, there are those like the Maharal and others who say that Gematria can't reveal to you something that you didn't know from someplace else. It might extend it into a new area, it might apply it in a certain way, but no fundamental discovery. As far as I know, no halacha is based on Gematria. No halacha is based on Gematria. No halacha is, disagreement is settled on the basis of, but this is the number of not in the Talmud or anywhere else. There is a beautiful example of this. Now I'll tell you, those who have some education, I'll tell you the idea, and you tell me what kind of book it comes from, what part of Jewish literature it comes from. The Torah says that the Egyptians made the Jews work with bitter, difficult work. The word in Hebrew is farech, pei, resh, chaf. Now, first of all, trade the letters of Pei Resh Chaf according to the Atbash coding. Atbash coding associates the first letter and the last letter of the Aleph base, Aleph and Taf, then the second with the next to last, Beis and Shin, and then Gimel and Resh, going inwards. That's the association. So if you trade Pei Resh Chaf in the Atbash trading, so then the Pei is 6 from the end, so it's a Vav, and the Resh is 3 from the end, so it's a Gimel, and the Chaf is really 13 from the end, so you got to go 13 from this side and go to the Lamed. And then you get a Vav, a Gimel, and a Lamed. Okay, now, the numerical value of those letters is, the Vav is 6, and the Gimel is 3, and the Lamed is 30, so you have 39. Ha! These are the 39 categories of work that are forbidden to do on Shabbos, and that were done in the tabernacle, and the Egyptians forced the Jews to do all 39 categories of work. Because the word in the Torah is Parach, and the Atbash trading makes it Vav Gimel Lamed, and Vav Gimel Lamed in Gematria is 39, and that's what it is. Okay? What section of Jewish literature does such an idea come from?
No.
So I hear a volunteer for the Hasidic tradition, and maybe for some of the mystical Sephardi traditions, so on. Well, it's Taisus, boys and girls. It's Taisus in Arvei Psachim. So it's as authoritative as you can get. If you want to call it Hasidic, we'll accept Taisus as Hasidic. No question, no problem. You know, we'll be happy to have them on the team. But the 39 in the Mishkan is something that's independently documented. The 39 forbidden on Shabbos is independently documented, and that the Egyptians caused us to work, and in all different kinds of work. There are midrashim about all the different kinds of work that they did. So what are we getting here that we didn't get before? A number 39 for the various things that in Egypt they made us do. That's not like inventing tefillin or inventing Shabbos or inventing. It's a question of looking at that and then saying, this capacity for physically creative, artistic labor is something which can be used for creating a place for God's presence. It can be superseded by God's presence in the Shabbos, and it can be the service to a master of a slave. And then you get a broad picture of how to look at the creative physical capacities of a human being. That's where you use these kinds of codings, but not for anything that could develop a new idea or a new principle or a new law or a new theological principle. No, it doesn't use that way. Yes?
What is the difference between the Nefesh and the Ruach?
Okay, Nefesh and Ruach. Now, these are terms that the Kabbalah discusses in great detail, and there's a lot of detailed information. What I'm telling you now is, a summary of a headline. But since you asked, one way to describe the three elements out of 5 that make up the spirituality of a person, and not everybody will agree on this terminology. What I'll tell you now, the Rambam wouldn't agree with, but this is the way I think the majority look at it. The Nefesh is something which is very closely allied with the body. The Nefesh is the part of the spirituality of the person that is responsible for enabling the body to do what it does, and to guide its development, which would include gestation and all the rest, and all of its functions. Indeed, the Ramchal in the Derech Hashem used the word nefesh twice. One word is for the life principle of animal bodies, which is a physical thing entirely, and horses have it also, and the human body has it also. And then it's the lowest level of the spirituality of the human being, so that the connection is nefesh to nefesh. But one is spiritual and one is physical. But it's very... Ruach is... it sits in between nefesh and neshama. Neshama is where the intellect is. It's where one's appreciation of spirituality is. It's where one's appreciation of holiness is. And, of course, in terms of motivation to action, the nefesh is bodily oriented, and the neshama is oriented towards relating to God. And the ruach sits in between and takes input from both sides, and that's where free will resides. Free will resides in the ruach. and that's why it gets input from both sides and has to make a decision as to what to do in the basis of the contradictory motivations coming in from both sides.
So kind of like a person's consciousness is the Ruach?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that consciousness is the Ruach, because we are conscious of our values. We are conscious of our intellectual understanding of things. We're also conscious of the pain in your toe or the rumblings in your stomach, right? So I think consciousness embraces all three. But the question is what the function of this aspect of consciousness is in the three different areas. Some want to also associate Ruach with emotion, which is also not a wrong thing to do. That's a rough, very rough picture. Yeah. Rabbi.
In the time of the resurrection of the dead, when the souls come back into the bodies, what age are the bodies that they come back into?
That's it's a good question, but you'll understand the purpose of it, then you'll see that it really plays no role. You see, when you talk about the soul of the body, what you should really think of is an embodied soul. The body is a condition under which the soul operates. When the Ramchal describes free will, he describes it like this. There's a conflict in motivation between what the body wants and what the soul wants. And there are two choices. Either the soul will decide to control, manage, and direct the body so that it will do what the soul wants, or the soul will decide to relinquish control, the soul will decide to let the reins go, and then the body will function on its own. There's no contest here. There's no possibility of the body directing the soul as to what it wants. That's not possible. All control is in the hands of the soul. But the soul can decide to simply abdicate its control, and then the body will do what it will do, and it'll be destructive in that way. So the soul is put in the condition where it operates together with and through a body. The body doesn't operate. It has tendencies built in, but it doesn't operate. So now, what you need for a human being we define as a soul plus a body. Rambam wouldn't agree, but that's the way I think the vast majority, especially the Kabbalistic sources, describe it. So then, in order for there to be a human being, there has to be a soul plus a body, so the soul can be in an embodied condition. Now, when you are 25, or when you're 45, or when you're 65, you're responsible for what you do, and you make free decisions, and you take the consequences of your decisions. You're in that embodied condition. Right? When the resurrection takes place, there's no more testing. There's no more, according to most anyway, there's no more testing. So all you need to do is be the same person. The same person means the soul with that body. Now, you are not the same, different from the person you were at age 8 and the person you'll be at age 88. You're the same person in a somewhat different condition. It won't matter. Won't make any difference. That's the key idea here. You need to be in an embodied condition. There's a whole long thing in Chazal. We're coming to the end of the time. The agent is the one who should be judged, and the agent is the one who should be rewarded. That's why resurrection is necessary. It's morally necessary. Otherwise, the system is not morally correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Which part has the potential?
Which one has the potential?
Soul or the body?
Both. Through life, through free decisions, both the soul and the body transform themselves. No question about it. The soul builds itself and also transforms the body. Then the name of the project is to transform the body, to elevate, to spiritualize the body. In a way, the Ramchal talks about this in great detail. So, but both have tremendous potential, and both become transformed by the actions that take place.
But the actualization of that potential can only be done by the soul. The body's only a clear, right?
Again, if the body abdicates control, and then if the soul abdicates control, and the body operates on its own, what the body does will affect the soul. But it can't choose to do that. It hasn't got the power to direct that. It can only operate if the soul decides to abdicate control and leave it to operate on its own. So the ultimate determining factor is the soul, but that doesn't mean that the body isn't doing anything. When the soul determines that the body should operate freely on its own, then the body will operate freely on its own and will have consequences both for itself and for the soul.
The source of this is Hashem.
Yeah. Ad kedei kach, that according to the Ramchal and Derech Hashem, the body operating freely and undirected can drag the soul down to such an extent that it will cease to exist. According to the Ramchal, some people just fade out. In that book, in other books, he says that differently. The Rambam and the Rabban disagree about this issue. It's a very complex and difficult issue.
How does he disagree with himself?
Let me tell you something. There's an English economist, I forget which one it was, and he was interviewed by a reporter on some things that he had published. And the reporter said, I understand that you're now saying ABC, but 10 years ago you said something different. And the economist said, when I learn new facts, I change my opinions. What do you do, sir? You don't change your opinions? Right? Rashi changed his mind in his commentary. The Techias points out, he says this over here. Rav in the Gemara says, I said this, I realize now it's wrong, I changed my mind, and this is what's right. There's no benefit and no rationality in making up your mind. You're never going to change your mind. That would be awful. You would lose all credibility. You never change your mind.
Know which one to...
Usually the later one, because the later one takes into account the earlier one, and the other, vice versa, not true, right? So you take into account the later one. Yeah, last question. Yes.
If from the way it was described to us that perfection is obtained through the act of giving, does God need to give in order to be perfect?
Let's take your words. You speak like someone who's learned something. You talk about perfection being attained. Does God need to attain perfection?
Maybe not currently because he's currently giving.
But prior he did? So he went through a process of improving himself? He started off imperfect and became perfect? That's the picture we have of the creator of the universe? Shh, I can't hear him.
Of God, the world always existed.
What? Say it again?
God isn't bound by time.
Yeah.
The world has always existed for God.
Listen, if God isn't bound by time, that means no time words should be used. No temporal words should be used. Always is a temporal word. That means at all times. Don't say always. People say, for God, everything must be present. Present is a time word. So present doesn't exist either. Something that's outside of time is not present, is not always, is not connected to time. Time words don't apply. And the world is of finite age. That's the way it exists. It had its beginning, and it had been progressing only for a finite amount of time. That's a fact about the world. It says nothing about God because he's outside of time. If you want to talk about him that way, you have to be pure about it. One of my professors said, speaking of God outside of time being eternal, eternal means outside of time. And people say he's eternal, therefore he always was, is, and will be. That's not correct. So you can't do it that way. Certainly, God doesn't change. That's one of the key ideas of God. So God can't develop, can't attain anything that he doesn't have. He is what he is of necessity. That contains the whole of what he is. But you could ask your question differently, and then I think the answer would be positive, and that is maybe perfection requires giving. Maybe perfection itself requires giving. You aren't perfect unless you give. Why? Because perfection includes goodness, I guess, right? I mean, if you are the best there are, you better be good. Right? And then goodness shouldn't be just potential. It shouldn't be just, if I'm under these and these circumstances, then I will do this, but right now I'm isolated, so I don't. That's only potential goodness. Actual goodness is superior to potential goodness. If he's perfect, then he has to have actual goodness. Actual goodness means actual giving. Otherwise, it's only potential. So you can't be perfect without giving. Perfection requires giving. And therefore, he has always been giving. Because the has always is our time talk. And our time talk is within the creation. And he has always been giving. Okay. Wonderful to talk to you. Have a wonderful Yom Kippur and a wonderful Sukkot.